And I'll spare some of the Middle Eastern talk for now because I have some European news I want to cover. But before we do that, actually, we should move on to this wonderful New York Times article. Now, I'm going to read through it. I can't promise I'm going to read all of it. If it starts to get into filler, if it starts to get into fluff, I do reserve the right to skip around. So I'll try to keep it as brief as possible, but there's a lot to go through in this article, and a lot of it is admitting what we already knew. So I present to you The Partnership, the secret history of the war in Ukraine. This is the story of America's hidden role in Ukrainian military operations against the Russian invading armies by Adam Entous. Adam Entous conducted more than 300 interviews over more than a year with government and military and intelligence officials in Ukraine, the United States, Britain, Germany, Poland, Belgium, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Turkey, and I feel like a vital country is missing from that list. It's on the tip of my tongue. I can't find it. On a spring morning, 2 months after Vladimir Putin's invading armies marched into Ukraine, a convoy of unmarked cars slid up to a Kyiv street corner and collected two middle-aged men in civilian clothes. Leaving the city, the convoy, manned by British commandos out of uniform but heavily armed, traveled 400 miles west of the Polish border. The crossing was seamless on diplomatic passports. Farther on, they came to Rezhov Jasinoka Airport. I hope I pronounced that right. And if anyone familiar with Polish knows, they can feel free to correct me. Where an idling C-130 cargo plane waited. The passengers were top Ukrainian generals. Their destination was Clay Kaserne, the headquarters of the U.S. Army Europe and Africa in Wiesbaden, Germany. Their mission was to help forge what would become one of the closest guarded secrets of the war in Ukraine. One of the most open secrets of the war in Ukraine for anyone who has bothered paying attention. But it is worth noting this is in the New York Times. This is in probably what many consider to be, I don't consider to be, but what many consider to be the most prestigious news outlet in the world. And this is where the cream of the crop in many countries, many Western countries, get their information from. So that is worth considering that many in the U.S., many power players in the U.S., power players in Europe, look to the New York Times in order to understand what's happening in the world. So you're getting an idea on the narrative that is being weaved to them. But to continue, one of the men, Lieutenant General Mikhailo Zabrovsky, remembers being led up a flight of stairs to a walkway overlooking the cavernous main hall of the garrison's Tony Bass Auditorium. Before the war, it had been a gym, used for all hands meetings, army band performances, and Cub Scout Pinewood derbies. Now, General Zabrodsky peered down on officers from coalition nations in a warren of makeshift cubicles, organizing the first Western shipments to Ukraine of M777 artillery batteries and 155mm shells. Then he was ushered into the office of Lieutenant General Christopher T. Donahue, commander of the 18th Airborne Corps, who proposed a partnership. Its evolutions and inner workings visible only to a small circle of American and Allied officials, that partnership of intelligence, strategy, planning, and technology would become the secret weapon in what the Biden administration framed as its effort to both rescue Ukraine and protect the threatened post-World War II order. Wow. Today, that order, along with Ukraine's defense of its land, teeters on a knife's edge as President Trump seeks rapprochement with Mr. Putin and vows to bring the war to a close. I like how they refer to him simply as Mr. Putin. Now, I know there's some technicality when they use the title of the office and just a simple gentleman's title, but I think it's funny in context of even Trump is president, but Putin is just Mr. The arguaries are not encouraging. In the great power contest for security and influence after the Soviet Union's collapse, a newly independent Ukraine became the nation in the middle, its westward leaning increasingly feared by Moscow. Now, with negotiations beginning, the American president has baselessly blamed the Ukrainians for starting the war. How could he ever come to that conclusion? And has pressured them to forfeit much of their mineral wealth and asked the Ukrainians to agree to a ceasefire without promise of concrete American security guarantees, a peace with no certainty of continued peace. Mr. Trump has already begun to wind down elements of the partnership sealed in the Wiesbaden the, in that day spring of 2022. Yet to trace its history is to better understand how the Ukrainians were able to survive across the 3 long years of war in the face of a far larger, far more powerful enemy, who I was assured the Ukrainians wiped out 90% of multiple times over. I could be wrong, though. It is also to see, through a secret keyhole, how the war came to today's precarious place. I do like how you're already starting to see the makings of how this is going to be all Trump's fault for ruining the Biden dream team in order to save Ukraine, despite little concrete action to suggest that might be the case. But to continue, with remarkable transparency, I can't say that without laughing, the Pentagon has offered a public inventory of the $66.5 billion array of weaponry supplied to Ukraine, including, at last count, more than half a billion rounds of small arms ammunition grenades, 10,000 Javelin anti-armor weapons, 3,000 Stinger anti-aircraft systems. Oh, remember the Stingers? I remember the Stingers, the Javelins. 272 howitzers, 76 tanks, 40 high-mobility artillery rocket systems, 20 Mi-17 helicopters, and 3 Patriot air defense batteries. But a New York Times investigation reveals that America was woven into a war far more intimately and broadly than previously understood for anyone not paying attention. At critical moments, the partnership was the backbone of the Ukrainian military operations that, by U.S. counts, have killed or wounded more than 700,000 Russian soldiers. Ukraine has put its casualty toll at 435,000. That's, I mean, 435,000 is a lot more reasonable, but I don't think it's close to reality in the slightest. But what else would you expect? Side by side in Wiesbaden's Mission Command Center, American and Ukrainian officers planned Kiev's counteroffensives, a vast American intelligence collection effort, both guided big picture and battle strategy and funneled precise targeting information down to Ukrainian soldiers in the field. One European intelligence chief recalled being taken aback to learn how deeply enmeshed his NATO counterparts had become in Ukrainian operations. They're part of the kill chain now, he said. The partnership's guiding idea was this close cooperation might allow Ukraine to accomplish the unlikeliest feats, to deliver the invading Russian army a crushing blow, and to strike after successful strike in the first chapters of the war, enabled by Ukrainian bravery and dexterity, but also Russian incompetence. That underdog ambition increasingly seemed within reach. The article will go on later, and I'll get to it when I get to it, about how directly involved the Americans were in Ukraine. What anyone who was actually paying attention, as I keep repeating, to this war, whether it be on this show, whether it be from a number of other programs, not even programs that are maybe as biased as this one, or some of the other ones that one might think of, but some of the ones that are a bit more objective and might even have some more sympathies to the Ukrainians, would outright tell you that, yes, this is the case. But when it comes to the regime newspaper, the de facto state media, that is the New York Times, it's just now, after 3 years of war coming out, that the Ukrainians were taking the marching orders from the Americans, and that many of the advanced military operations, when it comes to missile systems, when it comes to aircraft, when it comes to radars, etc., were operated by NATO and in particular the United States. And like I said, this should come as a surprise to no one who's been paying attention. But I continue. An early proof of concept was a campaign against one of Russia's most feared battle groups, the 58th Combined Arms Army. In mid-2022, using American intelligence and targeting information, the Ukrainians unleashed a rocket barrage at the headquarters of the 58th in Kherson region, killing generals and staff officers inside. Again and again, the group set up another location. Each time, Americans found it and Ukrainians destroyed it. Farther south, the partners set their sights on the Crimean port of Sevastopol, where the Russian Black Sea fleet loaded missiles destined for Ukrainian targets onto warships and submarines. At its height of the 2022 counteroffensive, a pre-dawn swarm of maritime drones, with support from the Central Intelligence Agency, attacked the port, damaging several warships and prompting the Russians to begin pulling them back. Now, once again, you can go back in our show archives, you can go back into a number of people who have covered this war for a much more honest appraisal of the 2022 counteroffensive and the happenings, particularly with the drone attacks on Crimea, which, while this article does paint them as something that they were not, it was one of Russia's weaker moments of the war. I will fully admit that. But to continue on, but ultimately the partnership strained, and the arc of war shifted amid rivalries, resentment, diverging imperatives, and agendas. Here's where we get the throwing under the bus. Here's where we get the snaking on Ukraine, probably that I haven't seen since we thought the Ukrainian war effort was in a much more precarious situation. I remember seeing some of these murmurs after the 2023 counteroffensive, but what they do to the Ukrainians here, the narrative that they paint, you'll see when I get further into it, is a bit shameful, all things considered, given the true nature of this war. The Ukrainians sometimes saw the Americans as overbearing and controlling, the prototypical patronizing American. The Americans sometimes couldn't understand why the Ukrainians couldn't simply accept good advice. Where the Americans focused on measured, achievable goals, they saw the Ukrainians constantly grasping for the big win, the bright, shining prize. The Ukrainians, for their part, often saw the Americans holding them back. The Ukrainians aimed to win the war outright. Even as they shared that hope, the Americans wanted to make sure the Ukrainians didn't lose it. As the Ukrainians won greater autonomy in the partnership, they increasingly kept intentions secret. They were perennially angered that the Americans couldn't, wouldn't, or give them all the weapons and other equipment they wanted. The Americans, in turn, were angered by what they saw as the Ukrainians' unreasonable demands and their reluctance to take out politically risky steps to bolster their vastly outnumbered forces. On a tactical level, the partnership yielded triumph after triumph. Yet, an arguably pivotal moment in the war, in mid-2023, the Ukrainians mounted a counteroffensive to build victorious momentum after the first year's success. The strategy devised in Wiesbaden fell victim to fractious internal politics of Ukraine. The President Volodymyr Zelensky versus his military chief and potential electoral rival, that being Zaluzhny, and the military chief versus his headstrong subordinate commander, that being Syrskyi. When Zelensky sided with subordinate, the Ukrainians poured vast complements of men and resources into a finally futile campaign to recapture the devastated city of Bakhmut. Within months, the entire counteroffensive ended in stillborn failure. Now, what they're referring to was the Ukrainian attempts for a southern offensive towards Zaporozhye, or the occupied parts of the Zaporozhye Oblast. The Russians didn't take the bait, continued on Bakhmut. The Ukrainians were forced to engage in Bakhmut, which turned it into the battle that we saw, the so-called meat grinder that we saw, even though maybe this article won't tell you it was much more of a meat grinder for one side than the other, but I digress. The partnership operated in the shadow of the deepest geopolitical fear, that Mr. Putin might see it as a breaching red line of military engagement and make good on his own often brandished nuclear threats. The story of the partnership shows how close the Americans and their allies sometimes came to that red line, how increasingly dire events forced them, some said too slowly, to advance in more perilous ground, and how they carefully devised protocols to remain on the safe side. It's alright bragging that they tiptoed around the nukes flying, and that they tiptoed around a potentially severe Russian response. Now, whether you believe the Russians would have gone to that level or not, frankly, that's not a gamble worth taking, in my opinion. But they'll come out and they'll say it as if it were some great triumph. Time again, the Biden administration authorized clandestine operations that had previously prohibited. American military advisors were dispatched to Kyiv. I'm going to keep doing that until they revoke the spelling and go back to the standard spelling. I hope you all understand that. And later allowed it to travel closer to the fighting. Military and CIA officers in Wiesbaden helped plan and support a campaign of Ukrainian strikes in Russian annexed Crimea. Finally, the military and then CIA received the green light to enable pinpoint strikes deep inside Russia itself. In some ways, Ukraine was on a wider canvas a rematch in the long history of the U.S.-Russia proxy wars, Vietnam in the 1960s, Afghanistan in the 1980s, Syria 3 decades later. It was also a grand experiment in warfighting, one that would not only help the Ukrainians but reward the Americans with lessons of for any future war. During the wars against the Taliban and Al Qaeda in Afghanistan and against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, American forces conducted their own ground operation, supported by those of their local ground partners. In Ukraine, by contrast, the U.S. military wasn't allowed to deploy any of its own soldiers on the battlefield, and would have to help remotely. And that's if you discount the number of American mercenaries who went, the number of American quote-unquote volunteers who went, and of course the Americans who were operating many of the missile systems, even the HIMARS. But I digress. Would the precision targeting honed against terrorist groups be effective in conflict with one of the most powerful militaries in the world? Would Ukrainian artillerymen fire the howitzers without hesitation at coordinates sent by American officers in a headquarters 1,300 miles away? Would Ukrainian commanders, based on intelligence relayed by a disembodied American voice pleading, "There's nobody there, go," to order infantrymen to enter a village behind enemy lines? Well, I mean, once again, it's trying to make the American war effort seem much more detached than it actually was, while also weaving in that the Americans and the Ukrainians had this deep, long-standing partnership where the Americans are practically guiding the Ukrainian war effort, which is the case. But once again, they'll throw in stuff like this in order to try to give the illusion of some layer of separation. And also, I think this first sentence particularly is funny. Uh, when one of the models they used for the invasion was Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, and that the Russian army would be easily repulsed as Saddam Hussein was from Kuwait. But to continue, the answers to those questions, in truth, the partnership's entire trajectory, would hinge on how well American and Ukrainian officers would trust one another. I will never lie to you. If you lied to me, we're done. General Zabrowski recalled General Donahue telling him at their first meeting, "I feel the exact same way," the Ukrainian replied. Part 1. Building Trust and a Killing Machine. February to May 2022. And it goes over some of the personnel. Lloyd Austin, Secretary of Defense, Baldwin, Biden, Cavoli, General Cavoli, General Donahue, and that shows some men on the Russian side, Siersky, Zaborodsky, and apologies, some of these were cut off, but I'm not going to hyper-focus on this, but to continue, try to get through this at a reasonable rate. In mid-April 2022, about 2 weeks before the Wiesbaden meeting, American and Ukrainian naval officers were on a routine intelligence sharing call when something unexpected popped into the radar section of their screen. According to the former U.S. senior military officer, the Americans go, "Oh, that's the Moskva." The Ukrainians go, "I'm not. You know what? That didn't happen. I'm not going to say that. That didn't happen." The Moskva was the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The Russians sank it. The Ukrainians sank it. That once again, if you recall that story, that was one of the big propaganda pieces where yes, the Ukrainians damaged it. It was not sank, but it also gave the impression this was much more of a naval war than it actually was. And continuing on with this, the sinking was a signal triumph that displayed Ukrainian skill, Russian ineptitude, blah blah blah. But the episode also reflected the disjointed state of American-Ukrainian relationship in the first weeks of the war. For the Americans, there was anger because the Ukrainians hadn't given so much heads up, surprise that Ukraine possessed missiles capable of reaching the ship, and panic because Biden hadn't intended to enable the Ukrainians to attack such a potent symbol of Russian power. I mean, I doubt that. Sure, there were some concerns about risks of escalation. But if you listen to particularly Blinken and even to an extent Sullivan, who seem to be scarce from this article, as you'll find out, I don't think they gave two damns about escalation. Maybe publicly, maybe even on some practical level, but overall, I don't think they considered the risk of escalation. I mean, judging by, for example, the ISW reports about Russia, the Pentagon reports about Russia, like again, they were treating it like Saddam Hussein's Iraq, so I doubt they would have cared that much. But to continue, the Ukrainians, for their part, were coming from their own place of deep-rooted skepticism. Their war, as they saw it, had started in 2014 when Mr. Putin seized Crimea and fomented separatist rebellions in eastern Ukraine. President Barack Obama had condemned the seizure and imposed sanctions on Russia, but fearful that American involvement could provoke full-scale invasion, he had authorized only strictly limited intelligence sharing and rejected calls for defensive weaponry. Blankets and night vision goggles are important, but one cannot win a war with blankets, Ukraine's president said at the time. Petro Poroshenko complained. Eventually, Mr. Obama somewhat relaxed those intelligence strictures, and Mr. Trump in his first term relaxed them even further and supplied the Ukrainians with their first shipments of anti-tank javelins. There's the javelins, that the obsession of every Ukraine shill for the first month of the war. Then, in the portentous days before the Russian full-scale invasion on February 24th, 2022, which in no way was predictable, was completely unprovoked, all the regular things you got to get out of the way when we talk about the Russian invasion. The Biden administration had closed the Kyiv embassy and pulled all military personnel from the country. A small team of CIA officers was allowed to stay, mind you, at that point. The New York Times also did a write-up where there were at least 11 known CIA operating bases in Ukraine, the most in any country in the world at that point. As the Ukrainians saw it, a senior U.S. military official said, "We told them the Russians are coming. See ya." When the American generals offered assistance after the invasion, they ran into a wall of mistrust. "We're fighting the Russians. You're not. Why should we listen to you?" Ukraine's ground forces commander, Colonel General Alexander Syrskyi, told the Americans the first time they met. Syrskyi, General 200. Syrskyi quickly came around. The Americans could provide the kind of battlefield intelligence his people never could. In those early days, they met with General Donahue and a few aides with little more than their phones, passed information about Russian troops to General Syrskyi and his staff, yet even that ad hoc arrangement touched a raw nerve of the rivalry within Ukraine's military between Syrskyi and his boss, the Armed Forces Commander General Valery Zaluzhny. To Zaluzhny loyalists, Syrskyi was already using the relationship to build advantage, which was probably true. You look at the circumstance in which Zaluzhny was removed. I think that is probably one of the more true things said in this article. Not that this article is full of lies and propaganda, which it is, but there's a lot of telling things, that's one of them. Further complicating matters was Zaluzhny's testy relationship with his American counterpart, General Mark A. Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In the phone call, General Milley might second-guess the Ukrainian equipment request. He might dispense battlefield advice based on satellite intelligence on the screen in his Pentagon office. Next would come an awkward silence before Zaluzhny cut the conversation short. Sometimes he simply ignored the Americans' calls. To keep them talking, the Pentagon initiated an elaborate telephone tree. A Milley aide would call Major General David S. Baldwin, commander of the California National Guard, who would ring a wealthy Los Angeles blimp maker named Igor Pasternak, who had grown up in Lvov with Alexei Reznikov being the defense minister at the time. Then Ukraine's defense minister, Mr. Reznikov, I suppose the article beat me to it, would track down General Zaluzhny and tell him, according to General Baldwin, "I know you're mad at Milley, but you have to call him." Ragtag alliance coalesced into partnership in the quick cascade of events. In March, the assault on Kyiv, stalling, the Russians reoriented their ambition, their war plan, surging additional forces east and south, a logistical feat the Americans thought would have taken months. It took 2.5 weeks. Unless the coalition reoriented its own ambition, General Donahue and the commander of the U.S. Army Europe and Africa, General Christopher G. Cavoli, concluded the hopelessly outmanned and outgunned Ukrainians would lose the war. The coalition, in other words, would have to start providing heavy offensive weaponry, M777 artillery batteries, and shells. The Biden administration previously arranged emergency shipments of anti-aircraft, anti-tank weapons. The M777s were something else entirely, the first big leap into supporting a major ground war. I'm going to try to read a little fast through this because this article is quite a bit of a slog, and like I said, if it drags too much, I will skip around, but right now this is just some establishing things showing the development of the relationship between the American and the Ukrainian staff. The Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and General Milley had put the 18th Airborne in charge of delivering weapons and advising the Ukrainians on how to use them. When President Biden signed the 777s, the Tony Bass Auditorium became a full-fledged headquarters. A Polish general became Donahue's deputy. A British general would manage the logistics hub on the former basketball court. A Canadian would oversee the training. So, big NATO coalition, as I'm sure you can see. The auditorium basement, which would become known as a fusion center, producing intelligence about Russian battlefield positions and movements and intentions. There, according to intelligence officials, officers from the CIA, NSA, DIA, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, were joined by a coalition of intelligence officers. The 18th Airborne, also known as the Dragon Corps, the new operation would be Task Force Dragon. All that was needed was to bring the pieces together was the reluctant Ukrainian top command. An international conference on April 26 at Ramstein in Germany, General Milley introduced Mr. Reznikov and a Zaluzhny deputy to Generals Cavoli and Donahue. These guys are your guys right here. Milley told them, "You've got to work with them. They're going to help you." Bonds of trust were being forged. Reznikov agreed to talk to Zaluzhny back in Kyiv. We organized the composition of a delegation to Wiesbaden, Reznikov said, and so it began. At the heart of the Ukrainian partnership, the two Ukrainian generals, Zabrodsky and the American Donahue. General Zabrodsky would be Weizenbad's chief Ukrainian contact, although in an unofficial capacity he was serving in parliament. In every other way, he was a natural. Like many of his contemporaries in the Ukrainian military, Zabrodsky knew the enemies well. In the 1990s, he attended the military academy in St. Petersburg and served for 5 years in the Russian army. This seems to be a pattern. You see this with Syrskyi. A lot of these guys who weren't good enough to make it in the Russian ranks went to Ukraine where they could take the higher officer commissions and, ironically enough, have ended up fighting against the country that they were once part of, the country that they abandoned because they couldn't make the cut. He also knew the Americans. From 2005 to 2006, he started the Army Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. 8 years later, Zabrodsky led a perilous mission behind the lines of Russian-backed forces in eastern Ukraine, modeled on one in part he had studied at Leavenworth. The Confederate General Jeb Stuart famous reconnaissance mission around George McClellan's army at the Potomac. This brought him to the attention of influential people at the Pentagon. The general, they sensed, was the kind of leader they could work with. Zabrodsky remembered the first day in Weizenbad. My mission was to find out who is Donahue, what is his authority, how much can he do for us. Donahue was a star in the clandestine world of special forces. Along CIA kill teams and local partners, he had hunted terrorist chiefs down in the shadows of Iraq, Libya, Syria, etc. As leader of the elite Delta Force, he had helped build a partnership with Kurdish fighters to battle ISIS in Syria. Cavoli once compared him to a comic book action hero. Now he showed Zabrodsky and his travel companion Kirilenko a map of the besieged east and south of the country, Russian forces dwarfing theirs, invoking their glory to Ukraine battle cry. He laid down the challenge. You can say Slava Ukraine all you want with other people. I don't care how brave you are. Look at the numbers. Then he walked them through a plan to win battlefield advantage by fall, General Zabrodsky recalled. The first stage was underway, training Ukrainian artillerymen on the new 777 Task Force Dragon would then help them the weapons to halt the Russian advance. Then the Ukrainians would need to mount a counteroffensive. That evening, Zabrodsky wrote to his superiors in Kyiv, "You know, a lot of countries that want to support Ukraine," he recalled, But somebody needed to be the coordinator to organize everything to solve the current problems and figure out what he'd need in the future. I said to the commander in chief, "We have found our partner." Soon the Ukrainians, nearly 20 in all, intelligence officers, operation planners, communications, blah blah blah, arrived in Weizenbad. Every morning, officers are called. The Ukrainian and Americans gathered to survey Russian weapon systems and ground forces to determine the ripest, high-value targets. The priority lists were then handed over to the Intelligence Fusion Center, where the officers analyzed streams of data to pinpoint large targets. Inside U.S. European Command, the process gave rise to a fine but fraught linguistic debate. Given the delicacy of the mission, wasn't unduly provocative to call their targets targets. Um, Blah blah blah. Targets. Once again, this is all minutia. If you ever get asked the question, did you pass the target to the Ukrainians? You can legitimately not be lying when I say, no, I did not. U.S. official explained. Yeah, points of interest. Like I said, it just gets into a bunch of minutia at this point. Um, each point of interest would have to adhere the intelligence sharing rules crafted by to blunt the risk of Russian retaliation against NATO partners. There would be no points of interest on Russian soil. How things have changed. If Ukrainian commanders want to strike within Russia, Zabrodsky explained, they would have to use their own intelligence domestically produced weapons. Our message to the Russians was this war should be fought inside Ukraine, a senior official said. The White House also prohibited intelligence sharing on the location of quote unquote strategic Russian leaders like the Armed Forces Chief Gerasimov. Imagine how it would be for us if the Russians knew that. Imagine how that would be for us if we knew that the Russians helped some other country assassinate our chairman, another U.S. official said. Like we'd go to war. Similarly, Dragon could not share intelligence that identified the location of those individual Russians. The way the system worked, Dragon would tell the Ukrainians where Russians were positioned, but to protect intelligence sources and methods from Russian spies, they would not say how they knew it, how they how it knew what they knew. Blah blah blah. All the Ukrainians would be on a secure cloud where chains of coordinates divided into baskets, priority 1, priority 2, so on. And Zabrodsky remembers it. When Ukrainians asked why they should trust the intelligence, Donahue would say, "Don't worry about how we found it. Just trust that when you shoot, it will hit it, and you'll like the results. If you don't like the results, tell us. We'll make them better." If anything, I would like to see the leaks from these chats instead of the signal chats. That would have been interesting if these ever get declassified or we ever see a live feed of what exactly they were discussing. But I'll continue. The system went live. The inaugural target would be a radar-equipped armored vehicle known as a Zoopark, which the Russians could use to find weapons like the Ukrainian 777s. The fusion center found a Zoopark near the Russian-occupied Donetsk in Ukraine's east. The Ukrainians would set a trap. First, they would fire towards Russian lines. When the Russians turned on the Zoopark to trace the incoming fire, the fusion center would pinpoint the Zoopark's coordinates and prepare for the strike. On that appointed day, Zabrodsky recounted, Donahue called the battalion commander with a pep talk. "You feel good?" he asked. "I feel real good," the Ukrainian responded. Donahue then checked the satellite imagery to make sure the target in 777 was properly positioned. Only then did the artillerymen open fire, destroying the Zoopark. Everybody went, "We can do this," a U.S. official recalled. But the critical question remained, having done this against a single stationary target, could the partners deploy the system against multiple targets in a major kinetic battle? That battle would be on the way in the north of Donetsk and Severodonetsk, where the Russians were hoping to mount a pontoon river bridge crossing, then circle and capture the city. Zabrodsky called it a, quote, hell of a target. The engagement that followed was widely reported as an early important Ukrainian victory. The pontoon bridges became death traps. At least 400 Russians killed by Ukrainians. By Ukrainian estimates, that's the important part. That's the important distinction. Unspoken was that the Americans had supplied the points of interest that helped thwart the Russian assault, which should have been obvious to anyone following the conflict that the Ukrainians did not have that level of ISR, and that it was clearly coming from an outside source, from a Western power, and it narrows it down that it was going to be the Americans. Of course it was. This isn't really revelation to anyone who's been really paying attention. In these first months, fighting was largely concentrated in Ukraine's east, but U.S. intelligence was also tracking Russian movements in the south. A particularly large troop buildup near the city of Kherson. Soon, 777 crews were redeployed, and Task Force Dragon started feeding points of interest to the Russian positions there. With practice, Dragon produced points of interest faster, and the Ukrainians shot at them faster. The more demonstrated the effectiveness of the 777s, similar systems The more the coalition set new ones, which Wiesbaden supplied with ever more points of interest. The 777s became workhorses of the Ukrainian army, but because they generally couldn't launch the 155mm shells more than 15 miles, they were no match for Russian vast superiority in manpower and equipment. To give the Ukrainians compensatory advantage is of precision, speed, and range, Cavoli and Donahue soon proposed a large, far bigger lead, providing the HIMARS, which use satellite-guided rockets to execute up to strikes up to 50 miles away. The ensuing debate reflected the Americans' evolving thinking. Pentagon officials were resistant to loans to deplete the Army's limited HIMARS stocks, but in May, General Cavoli visited Washington and made the case that ultimately won them over later. Celeste Wallander, the Assistant Defense Secretary for the International Security Affairs, recalled Milley would always say, "You've got a little Russian army fighting a big Russian army, and they're fighting the same way that the Ukrainians will never win." Cavoli's argument, she said, with the HIMARS, they can fight like we can, and that's how they will start to beat the Russians. At the White House, Biden and his advisors weighed the argument against fears that pushing the Russians would only lead Mr. Putin to panic and wind the war. When the generals requested HIMARS, one official recalled, the moment felt like standing on that line, wondering, if you take a step forward, is it World War III? Is World War III going to break out? And when the White House took that step forward, the official said Task Force Dragon was becoming the back office of the entire war. Wiesbaden would oversee each HIMARS strike. Donahue and his aides would review Ukrainian target lists and advise them on positioning their launches and timing the strikes. The Ukrainians were supposed to only use coordinates the Americans provided. To fire a warhead, HIMARS operators need a special electronic key, which the Americans could deactivate at any time. And also, to more than likely, American personnel were operating these HIMARS systems. I don't think that's really up for question at this point. HIMARS strikes that resulted in 100 more Russian dead or wounded came almost weekly. Once again, I would need to see more concrete evidence that Russian forces were left dazed, confused, their morale plummeted. Uh, with it, their will to fight. And the HIMARS arsenal grew from 8 to 38. The Ukrainian strikers became more proficient, and the American officials said the toll rose as much as fivefold. We became part of a small army, maybe not the best, but a small part of your system. General General Zabrodsky explained, most states did this over a period of 10, 20, 30 years, but we were forced to do it in a matter of weeks. Together, they were honing a killing machine. Part 2, when you defeat Russia, we will make you blue for good. June to November 2022. So this is going to be recounting the points of the Ukrainian counteroffensive in the fall of 2022. First meeting, Donahue had shown Zabrodsky a color code map of the region with American and NATO forces in blue, Russian forces in red, and Ukrainian forces in green. Why are we green? Zabrodsky said. We should be blue. In early June, they met to wargame Ukraine's counteroffensive, sitting side by side, tabletop battlefield maps. These people get paid to play games all day. This is really that simple. Zabrodsky then saw the small blocks marking Ukrainian positions had become blue, a symbolic stroke to strengthen the bond of common purpose. When you defeat Russia, he told the Ukrainians, we will make you blue for good. And this has been the crux behind probably close to 1 million Ukrainians dead, millions more displaced, was this ever vain hope of joining NATO. NATO, which was supposed to be there for their protection, for their umbrella, it showed, and I think this should be proof to nations like Poland, Romania, these other countries on the frontiers against Russia, that NATO is not for your protection. You are there to be the first wave. You are there to be the meat shield. And this little sentimentality, now you're one of us. If you defeat Russia, you can become blue. At that point, joining NATO would be pointless because they would have already defeated Russia. And at what cost? At what cost? It. Can you really expect anything else? It was 3 months since the invasion. The maps told the story of the war. In the south, the Ukrainians had blocked the Russian advance in the Black Sea, shipbuilding center of Nikolaev, but the Russians controlled Kherson, a corps of 25,000 soldiers along the occupied land into the west bank of the Dnieper River. In the east, the Russians had become strong. The Russians had been stopped at Izium, but they had held land between there and the border, including the strategically important Oskol River Valley. The Russian strategy had morphed into decapitation, the futile assault on Kiev, which was, as we know now, we know full well, and they still didn't admit to this article that it was a negotiating tactic. It was a bargaining chip. Uh, to slow stagnation, the Ukrainians needed to go on the offensive. Their top commanders, Illusiony, along with British, favored the more ambitious option near Zaporozhye in the southeast down towards Melitopol. The maneuver they believed would sever the cross-border land routes sustaining Russian forces in Crimea, at which point they already had the Kerch Strait Bridge and also ability to supply Crimea via both land, both air and sea on top of land. So, like I said, a bit of a moot point. In theory, Donahue agreed, but according to his colleagues, he thought Melitopol was not feasible given the state of the Ukrainian military and the coalition's limited ability to provide 777s without crippling American readiness. To prove his point in the war games, he took over the part of the Russian commander. Whenever the Ukrainians tried to advance, Donahue destroyed them with overwhelming combat power. What they ultimately agreed upon was a two-part attack to confuse Russian commanders, who, according to American intelligence, believed the Ukrainians had only enough soldiers and equipment for a single offensive. The main event would be to capture Kherson and secure the Dnieper's west bank, lest the corps advance on the port of Odessa and be positioned for another attack on Kiev. General Donahue advocated for a co-equal second front in the east from the Kharkov region to reach the Oskol River Valley, but the Ukrainians instead argued for a smaller supporting feint to draw Russian forces east and smooth the way for Kherson. That would come first around September 4th. The Ukrainians would then begin the 2 weeks of artillery strike to weaken Russian forces in the south. Only then, around September 18th, would they march towards Kherson. That was the plan until it wasn't. Mr. Zelensky sometimes spoke directly to regional commanders about, and after one such conversation, the Americans were informed that the order of battle have changed. Now, once again, these kind of claims I have a little bit of a hard time believing that the Ukrainians had veto power to the Americans because of just how crucial they were in planning the war. And that, you'll see this later in the article, a lot of it is shifting to throw the Ukrainians under the bus. That they were responsible for the mistakes. That these weren't ideas cooked up in Wiesbaden or the Pentagon. That it was all just the Ukrainian insolence going against the perfect ironclad American plans. Kherson would come faster and first on the 29th of August. Donahue told Zelensky that more time was needed to lay the groundwork for Kherson. The switch, he said, put the counteroffensive of the entire country in jeopardy. The Americans later learned the backstory. Zelensky was hoping to attend the mid-September meeting of the UN General Assembly, showing a progress on the battlefield he and his advisor believed would bolster his case for additional military support, so they upended the plan at last minute, a preview of fundamental disconnect that would increasingly shape the arc of the war. So on and so forth. The Russians reinforced Kherson, the Russians pulled back, blah, blah, blah. You all know the 2022 Kherson counteroffensive. I'm not going to go through the nitty gritty of this once again, especially from the biased New York Times perspective. Not that my own perspective isn't biased, but the blatant state propaganda that you're seeing right here. And once again, a lot of this is trying to pin the bumbling Ukrainians versus the wise and rational advice of the American command that in no way planned any of this. And don't worry, it gets worse in the article. And they bring up Ben Wallace, blah, blah, blah. And where some of the British intrigue comes in right now. Uh, so to continue with the talk about Ukrainian territory, perhaps no piece of Ukrainian soil was more precious to Putin than Crimea. After the Ukrainians halted advance on the Dnieper River, hoping to cross and advance towards the peninsula, this gave rise to what one Pentagon official called the core tension. To give the Russian president incentive to negotiate a deal, the official explained the Ukrainians would have to put pressure on Crimea. To do so, they could push him into contemplating doing something desperate, as they say. The Ukrainians were already exerting pressure on the ground. The Biden administration authorized helping the Ukrainians develop and deploy a nascent fleet of maritime drones to attack the Russian Black Sea fleet. First, the Navy allowed to share points of interest with Russian warships just beyond Crimea territorial waters. In October, with leeway to act within Crimea itself, the CIA covertly started supporting drone strikes on the ports of Sevastopol. The same month, U.S. intelligence overheard Russia's Ukraine commander Surovikin talking about indeed doing something desperate, using tactical nuclear weapons to prevent the Ukrainians from crossing the Dnieper River and making a beeline to Crimea. Once again, very much twisting what was actually said and making the situation seem far more desperate, that the Russians were just waving around the nuclear deterrence in order to stop any strikes from hitting Crimea. That simply was not the case. As much as I think that some people on the Russian side might have wished it was the case, it was simply not the case. The core tension seemed to be coming to a head, and Europe generals Cavoli and Donahue begged General Kovalchuk's replacement, Brigadier General Alexander Tarnovsky, to move his brigades forward, route the corps from the Dnieper's west bank, and seize the equipment. In Washington, Biden's top advisors wondered the opposite, if they might need to press the Ukrainians to slow their advance. The moment might have been the Ukrainians' best chance to deal with the game-changing blow to the Russians. It might have also been the best chance to ignite a wider war. In the end, a sort of grand ambiguity, the moment never came. To protect the fleeing force, the Russian commanders led a small detachment of troops. Donahue advised Tarnovsky to destroy or bypass them and focus on the primary objective of the corps. But when the Ukrainians encountered a large detachment, they stopped in their tracks, assuming a larger force lay in wait. Donahue told him that satellite imagery showed the Ukrainian forces blocked just by one or two Russian tanks, according to the Pentagon officials. But unable to see the same satellite image, the Ukrainian commander hesitated, wary of sending his forces forward. To get the Ukrainians moving, Task Force Dragon sent points of interest and 7770 operators to destroy the tanks with Excalibur missiles, time-consuming steps repeated whenever the Ukrainians encountered a Russian detachment. So once again, they're admitting that it was Task Force Dragon, it was the American and NATO forces that were doing a lot of the wider operations of this war, and that the role of the Ukrainian was primarily infantry. Not to say that they didn't operate their own equipment at all, but they're telling you outright what was happening, and they're being, in my opinion, a little braggadocious about all of this. The Ukrainians still recapture Kherson and clear the Dnieper's west bank, but the offensive halted there. The Ukrainians' short ammunition would not cross the Dnieper. They would not, as the Ukrainians had hoped, and the Russians feared, advance towards Crimea. And you'll recall the fall of Kherson was a Russian retreat across the river, giving up territory to the Ukrainians to regroup. What we saw in large parts of the 2022 counteroffensive, because the Russian troop numbers were simply not sufficient and that they needed to rebuild their forces and refortify their positions, which in many ways explains the failure of the 2023 counteroffensive. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Still, the Ukrainians were in a celebratory mood, and on his next Wiesbaden trip, Zabrodsky presented Donahue with a combat souvenir, a tactical vest which had belonged to a Russian soldier whose comrade was already marching east towards what would become the crucible of 2023, a place called Bakhmut. The best laid plans, November 2002 to November 2023. So we get to get into the 2023 counteroffensive, and here's our little cast of characters right here. Doesn't seem like the article has generated all of them, but I think for those of you who have listened this far, you probably have a general idea of who all these people are. So hopefully I can breeze through this last couple parts of the article, because man is this thing a drag, but it is telling. I do think it is worth reading, and it's also worth criticizing, so I will continue. Planning for 2023 began straight away at what hindsight was a moment of irrational exuberance. The Ukrainians controlled the west bank of the Oskil and Dnieper rivers. Within the coalition, the prevailing wisdom that the 2023 counteroffensive would be the war's last, the Ukrainians would outright claim triumph, and Putin would be forced to sue for peace. We're going to win the whole thing, Zelensky said, a senior American official had recalled. That's when they put out the trailer. That's when they showed that they were going to have the greatest counteroffensive in the history of warfare. And it detailed all their moves, hoping the Russians would piss their pants and retreat. Clearly didn't happen. To accomplish this, Zabrodsky explained as the partners gathered in Wiesbaden in late autumn, Zelensky once again insisting that the primary effort be an offensive towards Melitopol to strangle Russian forces in Crimea, what he believed would be the great denied opportunity to deal with the reeling enemy knockout blow in 2022. And once again, American generals were preaching caution. At the Pentagon, once again, the brash, irrational, and headstrong Ukrainian generals versus the wise and restrained and measured American forces. That's as we see the narrative they're trying to build. This is probably the worst throwing under the bus I've seen of Ukraine since the start of the war. At the Pentagon, officials were worried about the ability to supply Ukrainians with enough weapons for the counteroffensive. Perhaps the Ukrainians, in their strongest possible position, should consider cutting a deal. When the Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Milley floated the idea in a speech, many of Ukraine supported, including congressional Republicans, then seemed overwhelmingly supportive of the war, cried appeasement. In Wiesbaden, private conversation with Zabrodsky and the British, Donahue pointed to those Russian trenches being dug due to defend south. He pointed to the Ukrainians halting advance of the Dnieper just 2 weeks before. They're digging in, guys, he told them. How are you going to get across this? Blah, 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 talking about the general plans for the 2023 counteroffensive. Da, 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 da. Like I said, this is starting to get into the fluff and the filler and just the interpersonal workings between a lot of the Wiesbaden crew, which, like I said, it's all fluff. They're trying to paint this like it's some novel or some movie or some Netflix show where it's all about the character drama. So I'm going to get through some of this because once again we've already gotten some of the telling parts of the article, and I do want to get into Kursk where it seems like the Pentagon completely absolves itself from any responsibility, and it was just the antics of the Ukrainians that thought those would be a good idea, and that nothing from higher up came down. So, blah blah blah. Just moving on to this. Like I said, this just details a lot of Bakhmut and the 2023 counteroffensive, and it's, I guess, valuable information for somebody who has never paid attention to this war. They bring up the attack as being given to Ukraine, uh, the debate over that. So I'm just gonna actually skip down to part four because, like I said, this is dragging. So my apologies if this has been too long for some of your taste. And if you're on the replay, you want to skip this part, I don't blame you. So getting into the position where Trump is in office because you had Avdiivka, you had the replacement of Zaluzhny with Syrskyi, so on and so forth, and the issue of Kursk. So getting into just this last year of the war, December 2020, January 2025, when things really start to, I guess you could say, fall apart. Shortly before Christmas, Zelensky rode through the Wiesbaden gates for his maiden visit to the Secret Center of Partnership. Entering the Tony Bass Auditorium, he was escorted past trophies of shared battles, twisted fragments of Russian vehicles, blah 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 blah, all the fluff here. A year ago, the coalition had been talking victory. As 2024 arrived on the ground, the Biden administration would find itself forced to keep crossing its own red lines to keep supplying the Ukraine, to simply keep the Ukrainians afloat. But first, the immediate business in Wiesbaden. Cavoli and Agudo, who was one of the generals they had mentioned previously, explained that there were no plausible paths to reclaiming significant territories in 2024. A coalition simply could not provide all the equipment for a major counteroffensive, nor could the Ukrainians build an army big enough to mount one. The Ukrainians would have to temper expectations, focusing on achievable objectives to stay in the fight while building the combat power to potentially mount a counteroffensive in 2025. They would need to erect defensive lines to the east to prevent the Russians from seizing more territory. They would need to reconstitute existing brigades and fill new ones, which the coalition would help train and equip. Zelensky voices support. Yet the Americans, he knew he did so grudgingly time again. Mr. Zelensky made it clear he needed a big win to bolster morale at home and shore up Western support. Just weeks before, the president had instructed Zelensky to push back the Russians to Ukraine's 91 borders by the fall of 2024. The general had then shocked the Americans by presenting a plan to do so, which required 5 million shells and 1 million drones, to which Kovali responded in fluent Russian. From where? Um, fluent Russian, that's interesting. Several weeks later, a meeting in Kiev, the Ukrainian commander had locked Kovali in a defense ministry kitchen. Vaping furiously, made one final futile plea. He was caught between two fires, the first being the president, the second being the partners, had said one of the aides. As a compromise, the Americans now presented Zelensky with what they believed would be a statement victory, a bombing campaign using long-range missiles and drones to force the Russians to pull their military infrastructure out of Crimea and back into Russia would be codenamed Operation Lunar Hail. This is also stupid. Until now, the Ukrainians, with help from the CIA and the US and British navies, had used maritime drones together with long-range British Storm Shadow missiles and French Scalp missiles to strike the Black Sea Fleet. Wiesbaden's contribution was intelligence, but to prosecute a wider war in the Crimea campaign, the Ukrainians would need far more missiles. They would need hundreds of ATACMS. The ATACMS. I'm sure you all remember the debate and discourse around that. And as said previously in the article, that the Pentagon was adamant about not giving those before eventually caving and giving those. As the Pentagon, the old caution had not melted away, but after Aguto briefed Lloyd Austin, former defense secretary, on that the lunar hail could achieve, as an aide recalled, okay, there's a really compelling strategic objective here. It isn't just about striking things. Zelensky would get his long pine for ATACMS. Even so, one U.S. official said he knew in his heart of hearts he still wanted to do something else, something more. Blah, blah, blah. Now let me just get to the part about Kursk here. So for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to read from the summer 2024 part, this last bit of the article here, going over Kursk and the departure of the Biden administration going into the Trump administration, taking us to what's pretty much present day. Ukraine's armies, still in the north and east, were stretched dangerously thin. Still, Syrskyi kept telling the Americans, I need a win. A foreshadowing had come back in March when the Americans had discovered Ukrainian military intelligence, HUR, was furtively planning a ground operation to southwest Russia. The CIA station chief in Kyiv confronted the HUR commander, Budanov. If he crossed into Russia, he would do so without American weapons, intelligence, or support. He did, only to be forced back. At moments like these, Biden administration officials would joke bitterly that they knew more about what the Russians were planning by spying on them than about what the Ukraine's partners were planning. Once again, trying to absolve themselves from responsibility for the rash Ukrainian decisions. At least that's how I see it. To the Ukrainians, though, don't ask, don't tell was better than ask and stop. Lieutenant General Valery Kondratyuk, a former Ukrainian military intelligence official, commander, he added, we are allies, but we have different goals. We want to protect our country. We want to protect your phantom fears from the Cold War. In August in Wiesbaden, Agudo's tour was coming to an scheduled end. He left on the 9th, stating that the Ukrainians dropped a cryptic reference in something that would happen in the north. On August 10th, CIA station chief left for a job at headquarters. In the churn of command, Syrskyi made his move, sending troops across the southwest Russian border into the region of Kursk. For the Americans, the incursion was unfolding with a significant breach of trust. Sure, it was. It wasn't just the Ukrainians had, again, kept them in the dark, that they had secretly crossed a mutually agreed upon line, taking coalition-supplied equipment into Russia and territory encompassed by the Ostbox in violation of rules laid down that were created. Yet once again, they still authorized the long-range missile strikes in said region after the quote-unquote mutually agreed upon agreement was violated, which doesn't give me much confidence that was the case. The box had been established to prevent a humanitarian disaster in Kharkov, not so the Ukrainians could take advantage of it to seize on Russian soil. It wasn't almost blackmail, it was blackmail, a senior Pentagon official had said. The Americans could have pulled the plug on the Ostbox, yet they knew that to do so, the administration official explained, could lead to a catastrophe. Ukrainian soldiers in Kursk would perish unprotected by HIMARS rockets and U.S. intelligence. Kursk, the Americans concluded, was the win Mr. Zelensky had been hinting at all along. It was also evident of his calculations. He still spoke of total victory, but one of the operation's goals, he explained to the Americans, was leveraging to capture and hold Russian land that could be traded for Ukrainian land in future negotiation. Provocative operations, once forbidden, were now permitted. Before Zabrodsky was sidelined, he and Agudo had selected targets for Operation Lunar Hail. I'm sorry, these names still kill me. The campaign once required a degree of hand-holding not seen since Donohue's day. American and British officers oversee virtually every aspect of each strike, from determining the coordinates to calculating the missile flight path. Of the roughly 100 targets across Crimea, the most coveted was the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is still standing, linking the peninsula to the Russian mainland. Putin saw the bridge as a powerful physical tool, proof of Crimea's connection to the motherland. Toppling the Russian president's symbol, in turn, had become the Ukrainian president's obsession. It had also been an American red line. In 2022, the Biden administration prohibited helping the Ukrainians target it, even with the approach on the Crimean side were to be treated as sovereign Russian territory. Ukrainian intelligence services tried attacking it several times themselves, causing some damage. I'm sure you all remember that going back to October 2022. But after some partners agreed on lunar hail, the White House authorized the military and CIA to secretly work with the Ukrainians and the British on a blueprint of attack to bring the bridge down. Attackums would weaken vulnerable points on the deck, while maritime drones would blow up next to its existing stanchions. While the drones were being ready, the Russians hardened their defenses and stanchions. The Ukrainians proposed attacking with attackums alone. General Gudo pushed back. Attackums alone wouldn't do the job. The Ukrainians should wait until the drones were ready and call off the next strike. In the end, the Americans stood down in mid-August with Weidenbach's help. Ukrainians fired a volley of attackums at the bridge. It did not come tumbling down. The strikes left some quote-unquote potholes, which the Russians repaired. One American official grumbled, "Sometimes they need to try and fail to see that we are right." Sure, once again, I mean, not that these divisions didn't exist, but I believe they are played up for the sake of the article in order to absolve the Pentagon officials from much of the blame that they bear for this. The Kerch Bridge episode aside, lunar hail collaboration was judged a significant success. Russian warship, aircraft, and command post weapons depots and maintenance facilities were destroyed or moved to the next mainland to escape the onslaught. For the Biden administration, the failed Kerch attack, together with the scarcity of attackums, reinforced the importance of helping Ukrainians use their fleet of long-range distance attack drones. The main challenge was evading Russian air defenses and pinpointing targets. Long-standing policy barred the CIA from providing intelligence for targets on Russian soil. Sure, they did. So the administration would let the CIA request variances, carve-outs on authorizing the spy agency to support strikes inside of Russia to achieve specific objectives. Intelligence had identified the vast munitions depot in the lakeside town of Toropets, some 290 miles north of the Ukrainian border, that was providing weapons to Russian forces in Kharkov and Kursk. The administration approved the variants. Toropets would be a test of concept. CIA officers shared intelligence about the depot's munitions and vulnerabilities, as well as Russian defense systems. On the way to Toropets, they calculated how many drones the operation would require and charted their flight paths. On September 18th, a large swarm of drones slammed into the munitions depot. The blast, as powerful as a small earthquake, opened the crater as width of a football field. Video showed immense balls of flames and plumes of smoke rising above the lake. Yet, as with the Kerch Bridge operation, the drone collaboration pointed strategic dissonance. The Americans argued for concentrating drone strikes on strategically important military targets, the same sort of argument they fruitlessly made on focusing on Melitopol during the 2023 counterattack. But the Ukrainians insisted on attacking a wider menu of targets, including oil and gas facilities, which would be politically sensitive sites around Moscow, though they would do so without CIA help, so they say. Russian public opinion is going to turn on Putin, Zelensky told the American Secretary of State Blinken in Kiev in September. "You are wrong. We know the Russians." Austin Cavoli traveled to Kiev in October. Year by year, Biden administration has been providing Ukrainians with ever more sophisticated arsenal of weaponry that had crossed so many of its red lines. Still, the defense secretary and the general were worrying about the messaging written in the weakening situation on the ground. The Russians have been making slow but steady progress against the depleted Ukrainian forces in the east towards the city of Pokrovsk. Their quote-unquote big target, one American official called it. They're also clawing back some territory in Kursk. Yes, the Russian casualties had spiked even between 1,000 and 1,500 a day, but they'd still kept coming. I mean, take that for what you will. I have my doubts. Mr. Austin would later recount how he contemplated manpower mismatched as he looked out of the window of his armored SUV snaking through the Kiev streets. I think this is around the time he disappeared for like a month or so. He was struck, he told the aides, by the sight of so many men in their 20s, almost none of them in uniform. In a nation at war, he explained, men this age are usually away in the fight. One of the difficulty messages the Americans had come to Kiev to deliver that they laid out but they couldn't do for Ukraine in 2025. Zelensky, who had already taken a small step towards lowering the draft age to 25, still the Ukrainians hadn't been able to fill existing brigades, let alone new ones. Austin pressed Zelensky to take bigger, bolder steps and begin drafting 18-year-olds. Of course he did. To which Zelensky shot back, according to an official who was present, "Why would I draft more people? We don't have any equipment to give them. And your generals are reporting that your units are undermanned," the official recalled Austin responding. They don't have enough soldiers for the equipment they have. That was the perennial standoff. And the Ukrainians viewed the Americans weren't willing to do what was necessary to help them prevail, and the American viewed the Ukrainians weren't willing to do what was necessary to help themselves prevail. Zelensky often said in response to the draft question that his country was fighting for its future. The 18 to 25-year-olds were the fathers of that future. To one American official, though, it's not an existential war if they won't make their people fight. I'm In a way, it is both correct. I mean, this was never an existential war for Ukraine. It could have been avoided at many turns. But in a country with the demographic problems of Ukraine, not drafting men that age makes sense. But if you are some Pentagon official looking at this, you do have to wonder, well, what's the point? So, in a way, despite the fact that I disagree with both of them, they both do technically have good points, but I digress. Baldwin, who early on had crucially helped connect the partners' commanders, had visited Kiev in September 2020. The counteroffensive was stalling. U.S. elections were on the horizon. The Ukrainians kept asking about Afghanistan. The Ukrainians, he recalled, were terrified that they too would be abandoned. They kept calling, wanting to know if America would stay the course, what will happen if the Republicans win Congress, what's going to happen if Trump wins. He always told them to remain encouraged, he said, still adding, "My fingers crossed behind my back, I didn't really know anymore." Mr. Trump won, and that fear came rushing in. In his last lame duck weeks, Biden made a flurry of moves to stay the course, at least for the moment, to shore up the Ukrainian project. He crossed his final red line, expanding the ops box to allow ATACMS and British Storm Shadows to strike into Russia. After North Korea sent thousands of troops to help the Russians dislodge the Ukrainians from Kursk shore. Once one of the U.S. supported strikes targeted and wounded North Korean commander Colonel General Kim Yong-bok as he met with Russian counterparts in a command bunker. Once again, even setting my own biases aside, I saw no even sensationalist reports of that. I could be wrong, but even that just seems outright fabricated, not even misinterpreted, not even anything that they could have spun. I heard nothing about that. The administration also authorized Weisbad and the CIA to support long-range missile and drone strikes into a section of southern Russia used as a staging area for the assault on Pokrovsk, allowing the military advisors to leave Kiev for a command post closest to the fight. In December, Donahue got his fourth star and returned to Weisbaden, commander of the U.S. Army Europe and Africa. He had been the last American soldier to leave the chaotic fall of Kabul, and now he would navigate through the new, unsure future of Ukraine. So much has changed since when Donahue left 2 years before, but when it came to the raw question of territory, not much has changed. In the war's first year, of Weisbaden's help, the Ukrainians seized the upper hand, winning back more than half the territory lost after the 2022 invasion. Now they are fighting over tiny slivers of ground in the east and in Kursk. Once General Donahue's main objectives in Weisbaden, according to Pentagon officials, was to fortify the Brotherhood and breathe new life into the machine, to stem perhaps even push back the Russian advance. In the weeks that followed, with Weisbaden providing points of interest and coordinates, the Russian march towards Pokrovsk would slow. In some of the areas in the east, and Ukrainians would make gains in the southwest as the Trump administration scaled back support. The Ukrainians would lose most of their bargaining chip, Kursk. Once again, the limit to which Trump actually pulled back Ukraine support for Ukraine, and the time frame, it was negligible. The suspension of aid for a few days, the suspension of ISR for less than a week, it was negligible. I doubt we'll ever see the effects that it had no real impact on the overall situation in Ukraine. In early January, Donahue and Cavoli visited Kiev to meet with Syrskyi and ensure he agreed on plans to replenish Ukraine's brigades and shore up the lines. The Pentagon officials said from there they traveled to Ramstein, in which they met Mr. Austin for what could be the final gathering of the coalition defense chiefs before everything changed. With the doors closed to the press and public, Mr. Austin's counterpart hailed him as the godfather and architect of the partnership that, for all its broken trust and betrayals, had sustained the Ukrainian defiance and hope begun in earnest that spring day in 2022 when Donahue and Zabrodsky first met in Wiesbaden. Mr. Austin had a solid and stoic is a solid and stoic block of a man, but he returned the compliments as his voice caught. Instead of saying farewell, let me say thank you, he said, blinking back tears, and then added, I wish all of you success, courage, and resolve. Ladies and gentlemen, carry on. How beautiful, how quaint, and I hope you guys enjoyed slogging through the article. I'm going to make this a separate segment because I didn't realize it would take so damn long, and I'll go ahead and get back to the regular segments of the show. But this deserves to be its own nonsense, so we'll go ahead and continue on. That was quite the article. Like I said, very good at shifting the blame from the Pentagon to the Ukrainians. If only the Ukrainians had followed the wise advice of their Western advisors, none of this would have ever happened. But Zaluzhny and Syrskyi and Zelensky, they all had their own agendas, which once again, it did not paint them in a favorable light at all. Which, especially with Zelensky, who's been hailed as the hero of all of this for ever since 2022, really. It seemed like this piece doubled as throwing Zelensky under the bus, and also that the Trump administration just ruined it all. Which does track for the New York Times narrative, what they're trying to spin. So, I hope you guys got something from that. I hope that was somewhat informative. But I'll get back to the main segment of the show now. And for those of you listening to this as a separate segment, go check out the new War Report episode. And I hope that this aside, this separate video covering the article, was of some interest to you. And certainly let me know if I missed any details, if I skipped over anything pertinent, or if I have the wrong read on this. I am interested to hear back from what you guys have to think about that. So I'll hopefully see you on the next episode of the War Report, and have a good one.